What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, SBMTG. We like it in Magic, you know by now, when Ravnica Allegiance is out in paper on the morrow. Unless you're watching this on Friday, in which case it's out today. But by lucky coincidence, my patrons just happened to pick the deck that I actually was most excited about. And Ziggy's pretty stoked for it too, so let's go ahead and hit the stage and hopefully break a leg with the riggedy Rakdos. Now, the most important player in this production is definitely Judy, the Scourge Diva, aka Mariah Scary. I actually have a million of these. Beta Von Teese, Tina Burner, Celine Dion, or perhaps Barbara Dizan. Haven't quite worked it out yet. There's also Christina Gaguilera, and then there's Britney Spears, like an actual... This turned out to be the blood artist we always wanted and kind of didn't even know it. Like, the ability to hit creatures with her dies trigger is absolutely insane. Like, once the theatrics reach a crescendo, then sometimes she can take out like 2-3 guys on the other side of the battlefield, especially against opposing aggro decks. Sometimes her dies triggers are worth a wrath, more or less. And against slower decks, all that damage is going straight to the face, so this thing is ridiculous, and it makes combat a freaking nightmare. Like, it destroys combat math for all opponents, regardless of aggro, mid-range control, whatever. You know, they can't successfully really block any of your guys, or at least profitably, most of the time. You just kind of haven't lived until your Blood Artist, your Aristocrats payoff, is also your Anthem effect. That's unbelievable. So, Jude will make it bad. But even a Diva needs a good opening act. So the second name on the marquee for this deck is definitely Priest of Forgotten Gods, the most dangerous priest around. Which is really saying something. That's the first Catholic priest joke on the channel. Anyway, you put a couple of dudes in the offering plate, and it really pays off. There are a lot of strings available to the deck with this card. We can effectively have 5 mana available to us on turn 3 all total. So sometimes we'll drop Priest on turn 2. Turn 3, you'll play a second creature, 1 drop into Priest. Turn 3, a second 1 or 2 cost creature. Sacrifice those, and then suddenly you've got 3 or 4 mana to work with. So you can go like 2 drop into 3 drop that way, or you can play a 1 drop, sacrifice your guys, and then play a 4 drop, which is really important as well. There's a lot of different ways the deck has to be constructed to use that mana as efficiently as possible, and this also kind of gives us a heavy black commitment because we want to be able to use the mana it provides us as often as efficiently as possible. But the mana is just one aspect. Obviously, this kind of makes up for the fact that it doesn't attack well by doing some damage to the opponent, which is pretty sweet. You draw a card, they sack a guy, so it's really awesome against stuff like Carnage Tyrant and other, hard-to-target creatures. And the way the deck works out, especially once you get to the relative late game, is that you can clear a bunch of their creatures, their smaller guys, out of the way with Judith's death triggers. And then they kind of are locked out of playing big guys. If they have an empty board and you have a priest and 2 other creatures, they kind of can't play their creature, Again, they're effectively locked out at that point. If they draw into a Lyra Dawnbringer, normally that would be an amazing top deck. Or they draw into a Carnage Tyrant. That'll win the game 90% of the time for them. But if they windmill slam a Carnage Tyrant onto a naked board, Priest of Forgotten Gods is going to take care of that thing before we even move to our turn. We don't care about our dudes. They're there for the sacrificing. But if they're playing a big mid-range deck that only plays 1 or 2 creatures at a time, a card like this can be crippling for them. So this is way more than just the Aristocrats engine that I expected it would be. But since our whole steez is sacrificing dudes, we have to have some smaller guys here in the 1 and 2 drop slot to kind of jerk the curtain for us. Get things started, warm up the crowd. So we're going to start with 4 copies of Footlight Fiend. This is another card that's a little bit better than I thought it was going to be, and I'm not the only one saying that. A lot of people are impressed by Hotfoot. This can just block and kill 2 toughness creatures, which is sometimes important in that it can trade up some of the time in combat, and also it can just attack recklessly a lot of the time, which is exactly what this deck is looking for. It triggers Spectacle fairly easily, either off of sacrificing or dies triggers or whatever, so that's all of that is good in your 1 drop. It can also be played if we happen to get a mountain in our opening hand, but no untapped black source, which is also actually a pretty important part of this card that's kind of subtle in how important it is. Again, Priest pushes us into sort of a heavy black mana base, which means that our 1-drops are mostly going to be black, Footlight Fiend and the next guy. Whereas we could have gone like Fanatical Firebrand, Skirk Prospector. I'll talk about that deck a little bit more later, don't worry, we'll get to it. But again, since the deck makes us play so heavy black, we need black 1-drops. Footlight Fiend is that, but just in case we happen to get an untapped red source and no untapped black source, we can still go with this on turn 1. And again, that is subtly extremely important. Plus, if you have a Judith out, this is suddenly a 2-power guy, which means that it can kill like 4 toughness creatures. in combat, which is, again, just insane. So, like, everything about the card is kind of tailor-made for the deck. But I guess you say the same thing about Gutter Bones. You know, good old Gutter Bones. This guy, again, you know, we see a 1-drop like this every now and again, every few sets. And this is one of the best in a while. I actually like this more than the usual fare. Sometimes these creatures can't block or something, and this one can, which is pretty sweet. But mostly we're obviously using it for sack shenanigans and stuff. You know, we want this on turn 1 some of the time, but we'll take it on turn 3 after a priest too. And actually, speaking of Priest, you know how I was talking about we need to spend the mana that we get from Priest efficiently? Well, Gutterbones actually helps us do that, you know? Just 2 mana, conveniently, what Priest gives us, will allow us to bring it back from our graveyard to our hand if we've Spectacled that turn. And Priest, again, conveniently, turns on Spectacle for us automatically when we use our ability. And if all else fails, sweet creature to attack with on turn 2. You know, this deck is capable of some pretty fine starts when you just go like Gutterbones on turn 1, any 2-drop on turn 2 into Judith. Suddenly you're swinging for a pretty substantial amount. So Gutterbones is also just a fairly overstated body for the mana cost, and you'll take that every time too. But we need some more ways to sacrifice guys in this deck. We can't just call it an Aristocrats deck if the only thing we're playing is Priests. We're also going to play 4 copies of Fireblade Artist, a proper artist with a knife. And he is beautiful. This guy's only 2 mana for a haste 2/2, which again contributes to these extremely fast starts. We go Gutterbones on 1, Fireblade Artist on 2. Suddenly we're swinging for 4 on turn 2, putting them at 16 before they've even played their second land. That's pretty decent. But it also leads to some hot reach, especially in the late game. Like, let's say you've got a Judith out, and during your upkeep, you sacrifice Footlight Fiend to your Fireblade Artist. Whoops, you just did 4 damage to your opponent all in one shot, which is a pretty valuable thing to be able to do before you even attack or even draw your card, unlike turn 4 or 5. So this thing's reach is incredible. But the deck needs to fill out its 2-drop slots a little bit more, and there are a ton of ways to do this. Dusk Legion Zealot, Orzhov Enforcer, you could keep going on because, again, there are ways. But what I went with here was a 3 of Rixmati Reveler. Now, Rixmati is a slick body that actually has 3 different modes on it. The third one's kind of hidden. You know, obviously, if you just play this on turn 2, you rummage. You discard a card, throw something into your graveyard. You can get it back out later if it's a Gutterbones, or there are other ways to do it. We'll talk about it later. But if you play this on turn 4 as a 4-drop, then suddenly you're just drawing 3. It's absolutely nutty, you know, but the hidden third mode is that if you're hellbent, no cards in hand, and you play this, you just get to draw a card. You don't have to discard a card before you draw the card, but you still get to draw. And that's a really sweet hidden mode on. It's just basically like a better Elvish Visionary or Dusk Legion Zealot in those times. Now, that can be important on turns where your Spectacle well is running a little bit dry. You know, you're not always guaranteed to deal damage to your control opponent. If you were guaranteed to deal damage to your control opponent every turn, you'd probably win just about every game against them. But that's not the case. So there are going to be times where you just want that little bit of card advantage. You play a body, you get a card, and that is going to be fine with you. But on turns where you can make this a 4-drop and just draw your 3, it's maybe the best card in the entire deck. It just really lets you put your foot on the pedal and get all the gas you need to finish the game off. In a way, this is effectively another form of reach for the deck, because you're often going to draw into something that'll deal damage. But also in the 3-drop slot here, we're going to play 3 copies of Midnight Reaper, because we got this card again, just perfectly tailor-made for the deck. Notice that we've been getting pieces kind of at a drip rate. Every now and again, every few sets, we get another sweet piece for this deck. Let's finally all come together, and yeah, Midnight Reaper absolutely has to go in. Between Rixmati Reveler, Priest of Forgotten Gods, and now this, we get tons of card advantage in this deck. We get to draw a lot and see a lot of cards, which turns out is exactly what an Aristocrats deck needs. Not only do we need fuel for sacrifice fodder and stuff like that, but obviously we just need creatures to attack with, too, in this deck. We're very, very aggressive, and we're just finding all of our answers and all of our threats with all of this card drawing that we're doing. But do be careful, obviously. There are a couple of ways that we take damage from ourselves in this deck, so things can get pretty low when the Grizzly Reaper is mowing. So do 2 movie references in one video, but do be careful. But that said, the risk-reward is definitely beneficial to us. Let's put it that way. You do a cost-benefit analysis, and you come out on top still, because if you draw 4 or 5 cards a game from a Reaper, you kind of don't care that you just lost 4 or 5 life. You got a lot of card advantage out of it to help you finish a game off. Now, we're playing another card in here that is super versatile in its casting cost. We're playing Spawn of Mayhem in the deck. Spawn should go in here. He's got experience with killer clowns. See, I like comic books, but Al definitely goes in, is all I'm saying. At first, I was not thinking of playing Spawn of Mayhem in an Aristocrats deck. It didn't really quite make sense, but there's a lot of reasons to play this card. We again need to spend our mana efficiently on turns where we activate Priest, and this definitely helps us do that, On turns where, say on turn 3, we have that 5 mana available to us from a Priest activation. Then we can play a 2-drop, sacrifice it, and still have enough mana to play Spawn for Spectacle, and that is a really good way to make up for the fact that you just took 2 guys off your own board. It's also a fat flying creature, which we have exactly 0 other creatures that fly in the deck, so it's nice to have a big, meaty flying body that again helps us finish off games, and if games happen to go long, then it'll just do damage guaranteed every single turn, If we get to a lower life total than our opponent somehow, then yeah, we got to be wary of this thing too. It's not usually great if you're not in the lead, but it'll help you stay ahead if you are ahead, and once it starts getting bigger and bigger, it can even take down Lyras and Niv-Mizzets and Doom Whisperers and stuff. You just got to stay in the game long enough to stare those things down for a couple of turns. It also triggers Spectacle every single turn, guaranteed as long as it's out, As much as I was just given a screed about how you're not guaranteed Spectacle against control, well, every turn you can keep this thing out, you are guaranteed to trigger Spectacle, and you're probably doing at least 5 damage a turn just with Spawn, even if he doesn't have any +1/+1 counters on him. If you count the damage that he does, just from his ability. So this thing is actually really, really strong, and when you can get the Spectacle cost on it, you're more than fine with that. But even on turns where you have to pay the full 4 for it, you're still kind of fine with that. I think that's the secret with Spectacle cards, by and large. There are some that offer such a big discount that even if they have a bad starting mana cost, they're fine to play. We'll talk about one of those in just a second. But at the same time, I think that the really good Spectacle cards in this deck are the ones that are a decent rate, even if you don't Spectacle them. Like Rick's Mighty Reveler is a fine rate, Spawn of Mayhem is a fine rate, but when you do get Spectacle, it feels like cheating. Now, the last of our 31 creatures, that's a lot of creatures, but, Aristocrats, is Ravenous Chupacabra. Just a couple of copies of these, although I'm considering bumping this up to 3. This is a really important card for the deck, too. Again, on turns with Priests, where you have a bunch of mana available to you and you have to spend it, especially when you need 4 mana specifically, which will happen more often than you think. Footlight Fiend turn 1, Priest turn 2. Turn 3, you go Gutter Bones, and you effectively have 4 mana left. Ravenous Chupacabra is an incredible way to spend it. Not only do you put a body back on board, making up for the bodies you sacrificed, but you get rid of another body. So during that turn, they sacrifice a guy, and you spot removed a dude, which just decimates their board in the relative early game. You're actually ramping into Chupacabra at that point. So there's a lot of reasons to play this card just because Priest is in the deck, but aside from that, Ravenous Chupacabra is just a really, really solid 4-drop that's kind of a safety valve against bigger creatures that outclass this deck. Lyra Dawnbringer, if they actually get to it, is we have got to deal with that or it's going to kill us. So this gives us an option for doing that, or Niv-Mizzet without them even drawing a card. That's pretty important. Doom Whisper, a bunch of other big creatures in the format right now. If we happen to see, stupid Vanifar or something on the other side of the table, we can deal with that. Gruul Spellbreaker. The list goes on and on. There are a ton of creatures that we don't want to see on the other side of the board because they kind of just, brick wall our entire game plan some of the time if we haven't already done enough damage. So, with that in mind, Ravenous Chupacabra is the perfect sort of stopgap measure. That is also a creature. It's just important that the card is a creature in and of itself, but it also takes out all these big creatures that we don't want to see a little bit later on in the game. Now, the deck makes room for 6 spells, and 3 of those spells are definitely going to be Skewer the Critics. Honestly, I wouldn't mind a 4th copy of this. I'm just not really sure how to fit it, but I'm going to play at least 3, which is a bit of a deviation. I've only seen like one other Judith deck that played Skewer the Critics in the main, or at all, period. But I just think this card is too important. Very often, you need a little bit of reach to finish off the game. Even though the deck does have reach pieces, this is still very much an aggro deck that will get brick-walled starting on turn 5 if it hasn't done enough damage. Just talked about that. And this really helps us, once we draw late. If we have another way to trigger Spectacle, or even if we don't, we can just ignore Spectacle on turn 5 and play this for 3 mana, deal that last 3 to the face that we need. It's just really important to have a Lightning Bolt in this deck. And I'll play this over something like Lightning Strike because very, very often we're going to get the discount on it. Again, just in sequence with some of the crazier stuff we can do in the opening turns, Skewer is very, very good. But even if you rip this off the top on turn 7 and you have to pay full price for it, you're more than willing to 90% of the time to get a creature out of the way for combat or to just finish it. I should have said put a fork in him, because Skewer, that would have been the way to go there. But anyway, there's other spells in this deck, so we're going to play 2 copies of Gruesome Menagerie. This is also a relative rarity. I've only seen a couple of Judith-type decks in this format that have Menagerie in them, but I think this card is ridiculous card advantage. And you could play something like Experimental Frenzy in this slot if you wanted to, but most of our creatures, save for Chupacabra and Spawn of Mayhem, are able to be brought back with this. There's a lot of play on this card in terms of just card advantage, strings with Priest, but it's also just a great way to get back on board and clean up after a sweeper or a lot of spot removal from a control opponent. So the deck plays a lot, or the card plays a lot of roles in the deck, and I wouldn't take it out. But of course, after we show them our Menagerie, we have to go to the Theater of Horrors, it turns out. Just 1 copy in the main deck of this card, and even that I am apprehensive about. There's a couple of more copies in the sideboard, but again, you could probably get away with Experimental Frenzy instead of this, and it might be better for a deck like this. But I'm going with Theater because mostly we want some protection in long games. Again, this deck can sputter out towards the mid and later-ish game once you get to turn 5, turn 6. The deck starts to run out of options and runs out of creatures to sacrifice some of the times too. So you have to finish things off relatively quick, and this gives us a little bit of insurance to make sure that if the game goes a little bit longer than we're comfortable with, we can go check out a slasher flick, and suddenly we've got 4 or 5 cards at our disposal that we can throw at the opponent's face. Let's check out the lands briefly here, because there's not really much action to talk about. We're playing 23, and I've seen, 22 lands. I've seen 24 lands. I'll stick to the sweet spot, which I think is right in the middle at 23. We're not playing anything too expensive, and we have some ramp element in our deck as well. Notice I didn't pluralize that. Now, as far as the sideboard, I've made some other choices here that you won't see every day. Notably, Graveyard Marshal. I haven't seen this in too many black decks or Judith decks at all this season, but I actually think this is really good. You can sometimes play this on turn 3. We've got 17 available mana to us in black, and usually you want at least 18 to cast cards with 2 of the same color in their mana cost on turn 2. That said, we don't always want to cast this on turn 2. Sometimes we want to cast this a little bit later on in the game and start getting advantage out of our graveyard, helping to grind the game out. It's important in long games against Control, Golgari, or now Sultai, really, of the Wild Growth Walker decks. And stuff that gets advantage out of its graveyard. Graveyard Marshal can be good, again, in those longer, grindier games, and it can be cast off of a Priest activation, which I think is important to note. And, one more thing, it's a mana sink, something the deck needs more of outside of just Theater of Horrors. But there are also a bunch of different removal elements in the sideboard. We've got a couple of copies of Lava Coil. This is for dealing with Rekindling Phoenix mostly. That's a card we really don't like on the other side of the battlefield. But it also takes out random stuff like Prime Speaker Vanifar, and that can be very, very relevant right now too. But also the 1 copy of Bedevil. Now, this is for, kind of playing... We get to play a murder against mid-range decks, But also Planeswalkers, obviously. Things like Teferi and beyond can be taken out with Bedevil, and we need a couple of cards that are able to do that. You see the other couple of copies of Theater of Horrors. This is for control and, again, longer games like Golgari and the like. Drill Bit is insanely good against control, and I've seen all kinds of splits here. Sometimes you'll see, a 2-2 split, a 3-1 split. Sometimes people just won't play Drill Bit. They'll play the 4 Duress, which is the split that I'm referring to here. I'm just going to go all 4 Drill Bit here, because some of the times, even if you cast this for 3 mana, it ain't so bad, Jack. Now, Carnival Carnage actually has a couple of applications in this deck that might surprise you. Obviously it takes out small creatures, which there are a number of in Standard right now, but it also takes out Explore creatures like Jadelight Ranger and Merfolk Branchwalker while the Explore trigger is on the stack. So the Carnival half of this is actually really good some of the times, and it triggers Spectacle for what that's worth. But the other half of this Carnage, great against control and mid-range decks. Having effectively a Blightning against them is unbelievable. And finally, Angrath. You see a kind of a theme here. Control in mid-range. Can snatch a creature and really just change the entire tide of combat. And we have ways that we can sacrifice the creatures, obviously, post-combat. Or even pre-combat, we can just snatch a creature and then sacrifice it to Priest and get some real card advantage. We just got rid of 2 of their creatures in that situation, only sacrificed 1 of ours, got some mana, did some damage, drew a card. It's just crazy what Angrath and Priest can do together. But obviously, it's not dead against control either. This makes them discard cards and triggers Spectacle, does an extra 2 damage to them every turn before eventually killing them with the ultimate some of the time. Now, usually I reserve this section, especially early on in the format, for stuff that you could do with this deck. And there is undoubtedly a lot of stuff you can do. I didn't play Light Up the Stage, yada yada, there's stuff. But the main thing I want to focus on is the Goblins build of this deck. Now, just so you know, I will actually put a Goblins build in the description. You know, I'll put a link to that on TCG Player along with the normal link for this deck. So keep that in mind. If you want to see the Goblins list, I got one for you. It's in the description. But I think this deck actually could be really, really good. You want to play Goblin Chain Whirler, which kind of keeps you from playing black cards other than Judith and Footlight Fiend and maybe a couple of other things. But you mostly want to focus on red, and that's not hard. You get Goblin Chain Whirler, you get Skirk Prospector, which is sort of the all-star of the deck. You get really the main reason to play it, but you also get Instigator, which is incredible sacrifice fodder. You get Oracle, which is a good way to sacrifice your creatures without having to play Priest on turn 2. The Goblins deck is much more focused on 1 or 2 big turns worth of sacrificing and mana production and triggers from Judith, and that deck looks pretty fun. So if you want to check that thing out, again, link in the description. But that doesn't mean I don't think this is a powerful deck, as evidenced by the power rankings. Final score of 69. Nice. Jokes aside, though, that's a pretty freaking high score. Anything even close to approaching 70 is a very solid deck, and I think that's exactly what this thing is. Like, if you're a mid-range deck or a control deck and you stumble at all, like if you miss a land drop or if you sequence something just slightly improperly, this deck is going to capitalize on it and just jump on you. So this is one of the more fun aggressive decks in the format, and maybe the best aggressive deck in the format right now. So give this thing a shot. I know Priest isn't the most aggressive card in the world, but honestly, I really think that Priest just makes up for the turns where you can't get a profitable attack in. And starting turn 4, turn 5, though, that is important to be able to do. So I'm telling you, man, give this thing a shot. It's actually not that expensive, all told, at time of writing. It's not as expensive as the Gruul deck that I did last time, which I still think is a good deck. And it turns out a lot of you did too. Thanks for that. But in any case, I think that this is my favorite deck of the format right now, which, again, I am excited to bring you some other stuff. But I've been excited to play Rakdos Aristocrats since I first saw Judith, and it paid off. It's nice to have a card that we all thought was going to be good actually be good. But yeah, pretty sure that's it for the Rakdos deck. If you wanted to try this thing out, you know what to do. Hit the first link in the description and go over there to tcgplayer.com. They sponsor my content because they're good people. But they also want to give you the lowest prices on cards on the internet because, again, they're fine folks. So hit the link in the description if you want to get this deck for super cheap, but do all the other YouTube stuff for me if you would too. You know, hit the like button, hit the bell for the notifications, subscribe, do this well, subscribe, and then hit the bell is the order that's supposed to go in. But also, consider throwing $1 into the Patreon so you can vote on what decks you want to see next. There's going to be another vote coming up very early tomorrow. I'm going to get that out maybe even midnight tonight. So stand by if you're already a patron to make sure you can vote on decks. But if you're not a patron yet, throw your $1 in the pot so you can vote on what you want to see. I guess I'm done for this one. It just doesn't... I don't want to be done talking about Rakdos. But I guess I am, so I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind, and maybe we'll get back to the couch. Maybe I'll do a video or two on the couch every now and again. I think that was the other thing I was going to say. I know a lot of people lamented that, but maybe every now and again we'll do a video or two, you know, once a week or something on the couch. I don't want to make you guys sad, so we'll get back to it. Anyway, spread love and be kind.